The valley holds its breath before a storm. 40 acres of Colorado grass, gold and still, stretched beneath a sky that has gone the color of iron. The mountains to the west are disappearing, not slowly, not gently, swallowed whole by something moving fast and low along the ridgeline. She is already at the fence. A young woman, alone, her hands working the wire without hesitation, the way hands work when they have done something 1,000 times and no longer need permission from the mind. She does not look up at the sky. She knows what it means. She has always known what it means. Across the field, a light burns in a kitchen window. It has burned there every night for 3 years. She has counted them without meaning to. Then, hoofbeats, not from the road she expects, from the other direction. Coming fast through the dying light, raising dust that the wind takes immediately, erasing the evidence of approach before she can measure the distance. Her hands go still on the wire. The hoofbeats do not slow down. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. A pie carried across a field on a Tuesday morning, a wooden porch, a man who had forgotten how to expect good things, a woman who had been bringing good things for 3 years without being asked and without keeping score. This is not a love story about two young people finding each other in the flush of youth. This is something rarer. This is the story of a woman who saw clearly and a man who almost did not see at all. Set against the mountains of Colorado in a time when the land asked everything of you and gave back only what you earned. Tessa Langford was 25 years old and had lived on the neighboring property her entire life. 40 acres of working land on the south side of a valley that ran along the base of the Rocky Mountains, where the mornings came cold and the light came gold, and the silence was the kind that made you pay attention to what was underneath it. She knew the land the way she knew her own hands. She knew which fence posts would hold through winter and which ones were pretending. She knew where the creek rose in April and where it pulled back in August. She knew the sound of the gate at the Hadley ranch next door, the particular lean of the old barn that had been leaning that way since before she was born, and the way the first light hit the peaks to the west and turned everything briefly into something you might paint if you had the talent and the time. She ran the 40 acres alone. Her parents had moved to Denver 2 years prior to be closer to her older sister, and they had left the property in Tessa's hands because Tessa was the kind of person you left things with. She fixed her own fences. She managed her own cattle. She rode into Durango every other week to negotiate prices at the livestock market, and she consistently got better rates than men with twice her experience because she did her research before she arrived, and she knew exactly what things were worth. The men at the market had stopped underestimating her after the first year. Some of them had started asking her opinion on pricing, which she gave without apology and without pretending she found the question flattering. She was, in the full and practical sense of the word, competent, and competence in Colorado in 1883 was not a decorative quality. It was the difference between keeping your land and losing it. Cedric Hadley was 55 years old, and he lived on the ranch to the north. He was the kind of man that a hard life makes either bitter or quiet, and Cedric had chosen quiet. He worked his land. He kept his word. He had spent 3 years learning to live in a house that was too large for one person, and he had mostly succeeded in the way that a man succeeds at something he never wanted to be good at. His wife, Shea, had died in the spring of 1880. Not suddenly, the illness had taken its time, the way illnesses do when they intend to be thorough. Cedric had sat with her through all of it, every long night and every difficult morning, and when it was done, he had buried her under the cottonwood tree east of the house and gone back to work the next morning because work was the only language he still understood. That was what people said about Cedric Hadley afterward, that he went back to work the next morning. Some said it with admiration, some said it with concern. Cedric himself had no opinion about it. He simply did not know what else to do. The house was still there. The cattle were still there. The fences still needed mending, and so he mended them, and he fed the cattle, and he sat on the porch in the evenings and looked at the mountains, and he did not think about the empty chair beside him because thinking about it would not fill it. Tessa had known Shea well. The two families had been neighbors for 30 years. Her parents on the south property, the Hadleys on the north, and Shea had been the kind of woman who made a neighborhood feel like a community. She brought food when someone was sick. She organized the mending circles. She remembered birthdays and anniversaries and the names of everyone's horses. When Shea died, something went quiet in that valley that had always been warm. Tessa started bringing food 2 weeks after the funeral. not out of pity, out of the particular care you give someone you have watched carry something heavy for a long time, not every day. She was running her own property, and 40 acres required her full attention. Just Tuesdays, a pot of stew, or bread or pie when the apples were good. Cedric always accepted it with the same words. You did not have to do that. Tessa always gave the same answer. I know. They had this exchange so many times it had become its own kind of conversation, a shorthand for something neither of them examined too closely. A ritual that meant more than its words, the way rituals do when they have been practiced long enough to wear smooth. What Cedric noticed over 3 years of Tuesdays was that Tessa Langford was extraordinarily capable. This was not a discovery. He had known it abstractly the way you know things about your neighbor. But watching her arrive each week, always on time, always with something well made, always with the calm energy of a person who has already accomplished more by Tuesday morning than most people accomplish in a day, turned abstract knowledge into something specific and undeniable. She was also, he had noticed and immediately stopped noticing, very easy to be around. The conversation on the porch was always good. She had opinions and offered them without apology. She laughed at things he said that he had not been sure were funny. She asked about the cattle and actually listened to the answers. She talked about her own land with the unself-conscious authority of someone who understood what she was doing and did not need validation for doing it. He had categorized all of this carefully and without examining the categorization too closely under the heading of good neighbor. It was a solid category. It required nothing of him. He intended to keep her there indefinitely. On a Tuesday morning in September, she brought him an apple pie. She had made it the evening before. Good apples from the tree at the south end of her property, the ones that came in sweet in September, when the nights turned cold and the days stayed warm. She had made the crust the way her mother taught her. Cold butter, cold hands, do not overwork it. She crimped the edges carefully. She would later admit to herself, being more careful than the occasion strictly required. She carried it across the field under a sky that was doing what Colorado skies do in September, an improbable blue, the kind of blue that makes everything below it look like it was placed there on purpose, like the whole landscape was a composition someone had thought about for a long time. Cedric was on the porch when she arrived. He usually was on Tuesday mornings, as if he had learned the rhythm of her visits without acknowledging that he had. He was drinking coffee and looking at the mountains with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with mornings. She came up the porch steps and held out the pie. He looked at it with genuine appreciation. Cedric Hadley was a man who understood the value of a well-made pie, which Tessa had always considered a point in his favor. Apple, he said. September apples, she said. The good ones. He looked at the pie, then at her, and then he smiled. The rare smile, the one that arrived slowly and changed his whole face. The one that made him look like a man who had once been young and had not entirely forgotten what that felt like. If only I were 10 years younger, he said. He said it lightly. The way you say things that are meant to land gently and move on. A joke that was not entirely a joke. A door opened half an inch and then immediately closed. Tessa looked at him. The Colorado morning held them both in that particular quality of September light that makes everything look simultaneously real and like a memory. A hawk turned overhead, its shadow crossing the porch boards. The mountains stood where they always stood, doing what they always did, being exactly and permanently themselves. 10 years would not be enough, she said. And then, before he could parse that, before he could turn it over and examine it and figure out what it meant and what it did not mean and file it in a category that required nothing of him. She set the pie on the porch railing and said she had cattle to check and went back across the field. Cedric stood on his porch and looked at the pie, then at her retreating figure, moving across the golden grass with the particular stride of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and does not intend to explain it further, then at the pie again. He stood there for quite a long time. Then he went inside and poured himself more coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what she had said. He thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about it while he mended the Southgate hinge. He thought about it while he fed the horses. He thought about it while he sat on the porch that evening and watched the mountains turn from gold to purple to black. He thought about it, if he was honest, for considerably longer than that. Boone Merrifield arrived at Tessa's property on a Wednesday afternoon with flowers. Not wildflowers picked from a roadside on impulse, arranged flowers, the kind that come from a shop, tied with ribbon, placed in paper. And since there was no flower shop in Durango in 1883, this meant they had been ordered from Denver, which meant they had traveled by rail, which meant Boone Merrifield had planned this visit with the kind of forethought that announces intention. Boone was 28 years old, the son of Calder Merrifield, the most prosperous merchant in Durango. He was handsome in the arranged way of men, who have always known they were handsome and have learned to deploy it with precision. He had dark hair and an easy smile and the confident posture of a man who has never had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere, because he had always been told that he did. He had been making his interest in Tessa known since the previous spring. Not aggressively. He was too polished for that. He appeared at the market on the days she was there. He said the right things in the right tone. He complimented her cattle prices with the exact amount of surprise that suggested he found her competence charming rather than threatening, which Tessa noted as a particular kind of performance. Tessa received the flowers with the warmth she gave everything. She put them in water. She offered coffee. Boone sat at her kitchen table with the ease of a man who was accustomed to being welcome everywhere he went, and told her about his father's new supply contract with the railroad, which was substantial. He described it with the modest pride of someone who wants you to understand the scope of something without appearing to want you to understand it. The railroad was bringing commerce. The railroad was bringing growth. The railroad was, Boone explained, transforming Durango from a mining town into something more significant, and his father was positioned at the center of that transformation. Tessa listened. She poured more coffee. She acknowledged privately, in the honest and unsentimental way she assessed everything, that Boone Merrifield was not a bad man. He was pleasant. He was prosperous. He would, in all practical terms, be an entirely reasonable choice. The town was right about that much. Then Boone said something that landed differently from the rest of the conversation. He mentioned, with the casual precision of a man placing a card on a table face down, that his father had recently acquired several agricultural land mortgages in the county from the Durango Bank. He said it lightly, as if it were a minor detail in the larger story of Merrifield commerce. He said his father was simply consolidating local investments. He said it the way you say things that are meant to sound like nothing when they are, in fact, everything. You know how it is, Boone said. Land out here changes hands. Father likes to keep things in the family, so to speak, keep the community strong. Tessa heard every word he said, and she heard every word he did not say. She heard the shape of what was underneath the pleasantness, the way you hear a fence post that sounds wrong when you tap it, even though it looks fine from the outside. Boone asked if he could take her to the harvest social at the end of October. I will think about it, she said, which was kind enough and honest enough, and bought her time she was not sure what to do with. After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and looked across the field toward the Hadley ranch. The late afternoon light was on the mountains. The barn was casting a long shadow across the golden grass. Somewhere out there, Cedric was doing whatever Cedric did in the late afternoon, which she knew because she had been paying attention for 3 years, was usually checking the north fence line. She looked at the mountains. She thought about 10 years would not be enough, and what she had meant by it, and whether she was being foolish, and whether being foolish mattered, and concluded, after a long time at the window, that it mattered considerably less than she had previously believed. The town of Durango had opinions about Tessa Langford. This was not surprising. Durango was a growing town. The railroad had arrived 2 years prior, bringing commerce and newcomers, and the particular energy of a place that believes it is becoming something. And growing towns have opinions about everything, especially about young women who run properties alone and do not seem to need saving. Tamsin Whitford at the dry goods store told Tessa directly on the following Thursday, "That Boone Merrifield is a good man," she said, measuring out flour with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been measuring flour for 30 years. "You could do considerably worse." Tessa thanked her and bought her flour and said nothing else. Zella Vickers, who was 27 and recently married, and therefore considered herself qualified to advise on all matters of the heart, was more pointed when Tessa visited her that Saturday. "He has asked about you 3 times this month," Zella said. "3 times, Tessa. At what point do you give the man a chance?" "When I want to," Tessa said pleasantly. "And when will that be?" Tessa looked at the mountains to the west. Those Colorado mountains, always there, always reliable, always exactly themselves. "I do not know," she said, which was not entirely true. She had a fairly clear sense of when she wanted to give Boone Merrifield a chance, And the answer was approximately never, and the reason for that answer was something she was not yet ready to say out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things had consequences. The following Tuesday, Tessa rode into Durango for the autumn cattle sale. She stopped at the bank first, as she always did, to confirm the terms on her seasonal account. The bank manager, a thin man named Soren Talmadge, who wore his nervousness the way some men wear a coat that does not fit, sat across from her and told her something that changed the shape of her morning. The mortgage on her 40 acres, the one her parents had taken when they first homesteaded the property, the one Tessa had been paying down steadily and on schedule, had been sold, transferred from the bank to a private buyer. Soren Talmadge did not say the buyer's name. He did not need to. There was only one man in Durango who was buying agricultural land mortgages, and Tessa knew his name before Soren Talmadge finished the sentence. Calder Merrifield. How long, Tessa said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, folded on the wooden desk, were steady. Everything about her was steady because steadiness was what you showed when the ground shifted. Soren Talmadge told her the mortgage came due in 90 days under the new terms. The balance was 3 times her annual income. He said this with the particular discomfort of a man who knows he is delivering a verdict he did not write but cannot change. Tessa left the bank. She stepped into the September sunlight and walked to her horse and stood there for a moment with her hand on the saddle. She looked at the mountains, because the mountains were always there when everything else moved, and for the first time in her adult life, she looked at her 40 acres not as something she owned, but as something she might lose. Not because she had failed it, because someone with more money and more leverage had decided it was worth taking. She rode home through the valley, past the Hadley ranch, past the fence line where Cedric's property met hers, past the old cottonwood where Shea was buried, and she thought about flowers from Denver and supply contracts with the railroad and a mortgage sold to a private buyer, and how none of these things were coincidences. They were 3 parts of the same architecture. Boone brought the charm, Calder brought the leverage, and somewhere between the charm and the leverage was a simple calculation. Marry the sun, merge the land, everybody wins. Refuse the sun, and the leverage has teeth. 3 days later, Tessa saw 2 men she did not recognize walking the boundary of her property. They carried surveying equipment and notebooks and the purposeful stride of men who had been sent somewhere with specific instructions. They stayed on the outside of her fence line, technically on the public road, technically within their rights, but they measured everything they could see: the barn, the distances, the water access, the grade of the land toward the railroad right-of-way. Tessa walked to the fence and asked them what they needed. They said they were surveying for a railroad expansion project. They said it politely. They said it the way men say things when they have been told to be polite, but not to answer questions. Tessa watched them go. She stood at her fence with her hands on the top rail and looked across the valley toward the Hadley ranch, and she understood something clearly that she had only suspected before. Calder Merrifield did not just want her 40 acres. He wanted the entire corridor along the new rail line. There were rumors of silver deposits in the hills above the valley. Her land and Cedric's ranch sat directly in the path of whatever Calder was building, and the flowers and the courtship and the mortgage were not separate things. They were the same thing wearing different faces. That night, Tessa did something she had never done in 3 years of Tuesday visits. She broke the pattern. She saddled her horse after dark. She rode across the field between their properties under a Colorado sky so full of stars it looked like someone had shattered something bright against something black. The air was cold the way September air gets cold in the mountains, suddenly, completely, as if the warmth of the day had been borrowed and the loan had come due. Cedric heard the hooves. He came to the porch. He saw her in the moonlight, and he knew immediately, with the instinct of a man who has learned to read the weight of things by their shape in the dark, that something had changed. This was not a Tuesday. There was no pie. Tessa did not dismount at first. She sat on her horse at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him and said what she had come to say. Calder Merrifield is buying land mortgages across the county. Mine is one of them. I have 90 days, and I believe your ranch is in his sights too. Your land runs along the same rail corridor. There are survey crews walking the boundaries. Cedric listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask clarifying questions. He listened the way he did everything, completely, turning it over, looking at what was underneath. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The Colorado night held them both. Somewhere in the dark, a night hawk called from the direction of the mountains. The cottonwood where Shea was buried creaked in a wind that was not quite there. "I will not let anyone take your land," Cedric said. Tessa looked at him. This man on this porch in this moonlight. This quiet, careful, thoroughly decent man who had spent 3 years accepting her Tuesdays without ever asking why she kept coming. "I did not come here because of the land, Cedric," she said. The two sentences hung in the Colorado night like breath in cold air, visible for a moment, then gone. But the shape of them remained in the space between two people who had spent 3 years building something they had not named. Neither of them said anything else. Tessa turned her horse and rode back across the field. The stars did what stars do. The mountains stood where they stood. The distance between the two properties was exactly what it had always been, measured in acres and fence posts, and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have said something true and are not yet ready to say what comes after it. Cedric stood on his porch until he could no longer hear the hooves. Then he stood there longer. He looked at the place on the railing where she had set the pie on that Tuesday morning. He looked at the field she had crossed. He looked at the mountains, and for the first time in 3 years, the empty chair beside him felt like something that could be filled rather than something that had to be endured. He went inside. He poured coffee he did not drink. He sat at the kitchen table in the house that was too large for one person and thought about a woman who had crossed his field every Tuesday for 3 years without keeping score, and who had just crossed it again on a night that was not a Tuesday without a pie to warn him about something that threatened them both. He thought about 10 years would not be enough. He thought about "I did not come here because of the land." He thought about them together and separately and in every possible configuration, and he arrived at a conclusion that he was not yet ready to act on but could no longer pretend he had not reached. The conclusion was simple. The conclusion was terrifying. The conclusion was that the category of good neighbor, the solid and comfortable category that required nothing of him and kept everything in its proper place, had fallen apart, quietly, without his permission, and without apology, and in its place was something he did not have a name for yet. Something that had been building for 3 years beneath the surface of Tuesdays and porch conversations and pies set carefully on a railing by a woman who had been more careful than the occasion required. Something that looked, if he was honest, like the beginning of everything. If you are still here, if this story has found you wherever you are tonight, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because what Cedric Hadley is about to discover in that old house is going to change everything you think you know about this story. Stay with us. Cedric Hadley was not a man who processed things quickly. He was thorough, he was careful. He turned things over the way you turn soil, completely, looking at what was underneath before deciding what to do with it. And in the 2 weeks following the night Tessa Langford rode across his field in the dark, he turned over two things simultaneously. The first was 10 years would not be enough. The second was, "I did not come here because of the land." He turned them over while he fixed the north fence line, pulling out rotten posts and driving new ones into ground that was already hardening with the first edge of autumn cold. He turned them over while he moved the cattle from the summer pasture to the lower field where the creek still ran and the grass held longer into October. He turned them over while he repaired the barn roof on the east side, climbing the ladder with the particular caution of a man who knows that 55-year-old bones do not forgive the way 30-year-old bones do. And he turned them over during 3 separate conversations with his horse Flint, an elderly and philosophically inclined animal who had been on the Hadley Ranch for 14 years, and who had, over that time, developed the habit of standing very still and looking at Cedric with an expression that suggested he was listening carefully and reserving judgment. Flint's contributions to these conversations were limited to the occasional shift of weight and one slow blink that Cedric interpreted, perhaps generously, as agreement. But his attention was sincere, and sincerity, Cedric had learned, was worth more than most of what people offered in its place. On the 10th morning, Cedric walked out to the barn and found a man standing at his front gate. The man was old, 68, maybe older, with the kind of face that weather and years had carved into something that looked like it belonged on the landscape rather than in it. He stood straight the way fence posts stand straight, not because they are trying, but because they were set that way and have not been given a reason to lean. He wore a coat that had been good 20 years ago and was now merely sturdy, and he held his hat in his hands with the patience of a man who was prepared to wait as long as waiting required. Cedric stopped at the porch steps and looked at him. The recognition came slowly, not because the man had changed beyond knowing, but because Cedric had not expected to see him again, and the mind resists what it does not expect. "Sterling," Cedric said. Sterling Ingham nodded once, the nod of a man who has arrived where he intended to arrive and does not feel the need to explain the journey. Sterling Ingham had been the foreman of the Hadley Ranch for 20 years. He had worked for Cedric's father before Cedric, and he had stayed on through the transition with the quiet loyalty of a man who served the land as much as the people on it. He had known Shea for the entirety of their marriage. He had been there when she got sick. He had been there through the long months of it. And when she died, Sterling had stayed for 3 more weeks, long enough to make sure the spring calving went smoothly and the fences were sound. And then he had told Cedric he was going to Montana because the ranch did not need 2 men, and because the house without Shea in it was something he could not bear to walk past every morning. Cedric had understood. He had not argued. They had shaken hands and Sterling had ridden north, and Cedric had not heard from him since. Until now. "I heard things," Sterling said. "About Merrifield buying up paper on land in the county, about survey crews on the rail corridor." He paused. "I came back because Mrs. Hadley told me to come back when it was time." Cedric felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the feeling you get when someone opens a door you thought you had locked. "Shea has been dead for 3 years, Sterling," he said. Sterling looked at him with an expression that was neither apologetic nor confrontational. It was the expression of a man who had been given instructions by someone he trusted more than anyone alive, and who intended to follow those instructions regardless of what anyone, including the man standing in front of him, thought about it. "She gave me something before she passed," Sterling said. "A sealed envelope. She told me to hold it until the right time. She said I would know when it was the right time." Cedric came down the porch steps. He crossed the yard until he was standing close enough to see the lines in Sterling's face and the particular set of his jaw that meant he had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. "You have been carrying something of my wife's for 3 years," Cedric said. His voice was level. His eyes were not. "And you did not think to bring it to me. She told me not to. She was dying, Sterling. People say things when they are dying." Sterling looked at Cedric the way you look at a man you respect but disagree with, directly, without flinching, without yielding. "Mrs. Hadley was clearer in her last weeks than most people are, in their best years," he said. "She was not confused. She was not sentimental. She was making arrangements. And she told me specifically that you were not ready. She said you would need time. She said there would be a sign." "What sign?" Sterling paused. "When you open her room," he said. "When you open it and clear it and let the air in. That is when I will know you are ready to hear what she wanted to say." The 2 men stood in the yard of the Hadley Ranch with the morning light on the mountains and the sound of flint shifting in the barn and the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 people who are arguing about someone who is not there to settle the argument. It was not a fight about an envelope. It was a fight about who had understood Shea better. Cedric, who had been her husband and had sat with her through every night of the illness, or Sterling, who had watched from the barn and the fence line and the edges of the property, and who had apparently been trusted with something Cedric had not even known existed. Cedric wanted to tell Sterling to hand over the envelope immediately. He wanted to say that a husband's claim superseded a foreman's instructions. He wanted to say that 3 years of silence was 3 years too long, but he did not say any of those things, because underneath the anger was something he did not want to look at, the possibility that Sterling was right. The possibility that Shea had seen something Cedric had not seen and had made provisions for it, and had trusted Sterling to execute those provisions because she knew Cedric well enough to know he would not be ready until he was ready. Sterling turned and walked toward the old foreman's quarters beside the barn, the small room he had occupied for 20 years, and he went inside and closed the door as if he had never left. Cedric stood in the yard for a long time. Then he went back to the porch and sat down and looked at the mountains and thought about a woman who had apparently been planning things he knew nothing about while she was dying in the room he had not opened in 3 years. On the 14th day, Cedric rode into Durango for supplies. At the feed store, while he waited for his order, he heard the conversation that had been circulating through town for the better part of a week. Boone Merrifield had asked Tessa Langford to the harvest social. Tessa had said she would think about it. The general consensus, delivered with the confident authority of people who enjoy interpreting other people's decisions, was that thinking about it was practically a yes. It was only a matter of time. It was, people agreed, an excellent match. He was young and prosperous. She was capable and lovely. Together, they would consolidate two properties and produce, presumably, capable and prosperous offspring. The mathematics of it were sound. Cedric bought his supplies. He loaded them onto the wagon. He rode home through the valley with the October light turning the aspens to gold along the creek bottom and the mountains standing where they always stood. He put the horse away. He sat on the porch. He looked at the spot on the railing where she had set the pie, and he thought about a woman who had crossed this field every Tuesday for 3 years and never once asked for anything in return. He thought about Shea, not with guilt. Shea had been gone 3 years, and she had been, while she was here, a woman of profound good sense who had told him more than once that stubbornness in the wrong direction was just stupidity with better posture. He thought about what Shea would say about this specific situation, about the mortgage and the Merrifields and the woman across the field and the sealed envelope in the foreman's quarters and the room that had been closed for 3 years. He was fairly certain he knew what she would say. That evening, Cedric Hadley did something he had not done since the morning after Shea's funeral. He walked to the closed door at the end of the hallway. He put his hand on the knob. He turned it. The room smelled like dust and lavender and the particular staleness of air that has been sealed away from time. Shea's things were where she had left them. The quilt on the bed, the small mirror on the dresser, the books on the shelf, spines cracked at the places she returned to most often. 3 years of stillness preserved in a room that had been alive once and had been holding its breath ever since. Cedric opened the window. The October night air came in cold and clean and immediate, and the room shuddered with it, the curtains moving for the first time in 3 years, the dust lifting and resettling, the whole space exhaling something it had been holding too long. He stood in the middle of the room and let it be what it was. Not a shrine, not a wound, a room that had belonged to someone he loved and that needed to breathe again. He began to clear things gently, not throwing away, not erasing, moving, folding the quilt, stacking the books, opening drawers and touching things with the careful reverence of a man who understands that objects hold the shape of the person who used them and deserve to be handled accordingly. When he moved the small rug beside the bed, he felt the floorboard shift. Not much, just enough. The way a board shifts when it has been pried up before and set back down without being nailed. He knelt. He lifted the board. Beneath it was a small wooden box, the kind you keep letters in, the kind that fits in your hand and weighs almost nothing and can hold everything. Inside the box was a single envelope, sealed. Shea's handwriting on the front, the handwriting he had seen on grocery lists and letters to her sister in the family Bible, where she recorded births and deaths with the same steady hand. The envelope said, "For Cedric, when you are ready." He sat on the floor of Shea's room with his back against the bed frame, and he opened the envelope, and he read what his wife had written, and the words went through him the way weather goes through a valley, completely, touching everything. She had known. That was the first thing he understood and the thing that undid him. She had known about Tessa. Not guessed, not suspected, known. She had watched from this room, from this window, and she had seen the way the young woman from the South property looked at her husband. She had seen it before the illness, before the decline, before any of it. She had seen it the way women see things that men walk past without noticing, with clarity and without panic. She was not angry. That was the second thing, and it arrived in his chest like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. Shea wrote that Tessa Langford did not love Cedric because he was young or because he was wealthy. She loved him because he was the kind of man who brought lumber to fix a neighbor's fence the morning after a flood and never mentioned it afterward. She wrote that this quality, this particular and irreplaceable quality, was not something that diminished with age. It was something that age had built. She wrote, "Do not turn your age into a reason to spend the rest of your life alone. I want you to live, Cedric, not survive. Live." And at the bottom, in smaller handwriting, she had written, "Sterling has papers. Important ones. They will matter when the time comes." Cedric sat on the floor of Shea's room and he wept. It was the first time he had cried in 3 years. Not at the funeral, not in the weeks after, not in the long months of learning to live alone. He had held it all in the way a dam holds water, by being solid and by not examining too closely what was pressing against the other side. He wept not because he had lost her. He had known that loss for 3 years and had made his accommodation with it. He wept because she had understood him so completely and so far in advance that she had written him a letter from the future, from a time she knew she would not occupy, telling him exactly what he needed to hear at exactly the moment he needed to hear it. He wept because he had been loved that well, because while he had been sitting on the porch, counting his years and concluding they disqualified him, while he had been filing Tessa under a category that required nothing and risked nothing, while he had been telling himself that the distance between 55 and 25 was too great to cross, his wife had been lying in this room, in this bed, looking out this window, and she had seen everything. She had seen what he could not see. She had seen what he refused to see, and she had loved him enough to write it down and leave it where he would find it, not when she wanted him to find it, but when he was ready. The obligation was clear. It was the obligation of a man who has been given permission by the person whose permission mattered most. Not permission to forget, permission to continue, permission to let the next thing be the next thing, without apology and without guilt, because the woman who had the most right to object had chosen instead to bless. In the morning, Sterling saw the open window. He saw the curtains moving in the early light. He walked to the barn, reached behind the third beam on the left wall, and retrieved the sealed envelope he had carried from Montana and kept for 3 years. He brought it to Cedric on the porch. He did not say anything dramatic. He simply handed it over and stood there while Cedric opened it. Inside was a document, a certified copy of a mineral rights registration filed at the county recorder's office 6 months before Shea's death. Shea Hadley had, without telling anyone, without mentioning it at supper, or in conversation, or in any of the ordinary moments of their ordinary life, registered the mineral rights to the entire Hadley Ranch property under her own name. Mineral rights, the legal ownership of everything beneath the surface of the land, silver, gold, copper, whatever the earth held underneath the grass and the topsoil and the roots of the cottonwood tree, a separate legal claim from the surface property itself, which meant that even if someone bought the land above, everything below belonged to whoever held the mineral rights. And Shea had registered them quietly, legally and irrevocably, at a time when the silver rumors were just beginning to circulate and before anyone else in the county had thought to do the same. The original documents, Sterling said, are in Judge Prescott's safe in town. She filed them there herself, walked into his office on a Tuesday when you were at the cattle market, sat down, signed the papers, locked them in his safe, walked out, never mentioned it. Cedric looked at the document. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the mountains where the silver was supposed to be, the silver that Calder Merrifield was spending a fortune trying to position himself to control. She knew, Sterling said. She knew about the silver. She knew people would come for it. She protected you before you knew you needed protecting. Cedric held the paper in his hands and understood for the first time that Shea Hadley had not merely been his wife. She had been the architect of a defense he had never seen, built in silence, filed in secret, and entrusted to a man she knew would wait however long waiting required. If you are still with us, if this story has found its way into your evening or your morning, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next at the Durango market is the moment everything catches fire, and you do not want to miss it. The Durango Autumn Market fell on the third Saturday of October. It was the largest market day of the year, the day when ranchers and farmers from across the county brought their livestock and their grain, and their last harvest before winter, closed the passes and the valley turned inward. The streets were full, the noise was constant, the smell of cattle and wood smoke and roasting corn hung over everything like a low ceiling. Tessa was there. She had brought 6 head of cattle to sell and had already negotiated prices with 2 buyers by mid-morning. She was standing near the livestock pens, reviewing her accounts in the small leather book she carried, when a shadow fell across her. Calder Merrifield was taller than his son and carried himself with none of Boone's calculated ease. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, and he wore a black vest over a white shirt that was cleaner than anything else at the market, which was itself a statement. He was the kind of man who understood that presence was a tool and deployed it with the same precision his son deployed charm, but without the charm and without any interest in whether you found him pleasant. He stopped directly in front of Tessa, close enough that she had to look up, close enough that the people at the neighboring stalls could hear every word, which was not accidental, because Calder Merrifield did not do anything accidentally. "Miss Sheridan," he said. His voice carried the way voices carry when they are designed to carry. I have been meaning to speak with you about your property. Tessa closed her account book. She looked at him with the level gaze of a woman who has been expecting this conversation and has already decided how it will go. Calder told her that her 40 acres were, from a financial perspective, underperforming. He told her that a young woman without a husband running a property of that size was, he said with the particular condescension of a man who believes he is being helpful, admirable, but ultimately impractical. He told her that he was prepared to offer a fair price for the land, considerably more fair than what the mortgage terms would yield if the county had to foreclose. He told her she should consider his offer carefully. He said all of this loudly enough that the ranchers at the next pen stopped talking, that the woman selling bread across the lane turned to watch, that the entire middle section of the Durango autumn market went quiet in the particular way that a crowd goes quiet when it recognizes that something important is happening. Tessa looked at Calder Merrifield. She did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She did not do any of the things that Calder expected a 25-year-old woman standing alone in a market to do when confronted by the most powerful man in the county. Mr. Merrifield, she said, and her voice was as clear and as steady as the creek that ran between her property and Cedric's. That land was cleared by my father. My mother planted every fruit tree on it. I have paid the taxes on time every quarter since they left. You have railroad contracts. You have the dry goods store. You have your son bringing flowers to my door. But you do not have the right to stand in the middle of this market and tell me what belongs to me. The market was silent. The cattle shifted. The October wind moved through the space between them. Calder Merrifield looked at Tessa Langford and saw, perhaps for the first time, that this was not a woman who could be calculated into compliance. He stepped back. He adjusted his vest. He walked away without another word. But his eyes, as he turned, said everything his mouth did not. This was not finished. This was only beginning. Tessa completed her sales. She loaded her supplies. She mounted her horse and rode out of Durango and along the valley road toward home, with the late afternoon light on the peaks and the shadows stretching long across the golden grass. And on the ride home, alone on the road with no one to see, her hands trembled on the reins. Not because of Calder, not because of the market or the mortgage or the 90 days. Her hands trembled because, for the first time since she had taken over the property, for the first time since her parents had left for Denver and she had stood alone on 40 acres and decided she could do this, she felt the full weight of what she was carrying: the land, the debt, the confrontation she had just won in public and the war she had not yet won in private. The man across the field who she had chosen with her whole heart and who had not yet chosen back. She went into her house. She sat at the kitchen table in the silence. She looked at her hands, the hands that had mended fences and crimped pie crusts and held reins through storms and signed contracts and done every single thing that needed doing for 3 years without anyone standing beside her. She asked herself the question she had been refusing to ask. What if she was wrong? What if Cedric Hadley never walked across that field? What if she lost the land and the ranch and the gamble and stood in the middle of nothing with nothing to show for the years she had spent building something alone? She looked at her hands for a long time, and she decided in the quiet of her kitchen, with the Colorado evening coming down around her, that these hands had built everything once from nothing. And if she had to, they would build it again. The answer was not certainty. The answer was something harder than certainty. It was willingness. Boone Merrifield came to her door that evening. He did not bring flowers this time. He stood on her porch with his hands in his pockets and a different expression on his face, one that had less polish and more edge, one that suggested the performance was being set aside in favor of something more direct. My father is not a patient man, Boone said, but he is not unreasonable. If you were willing to consider a partnership, a practical arrangement, things could be considerably easier for everyone. Tessa understood exactly what partnership meant. It meant marriage. It meant merging her 40 acres into the Merrifield holding. It meant Calder would get the land without foreclosure, Boone would get a wife the town approved of, and Tessa would get security in exchange for everything she had built and everything she was. She looked at Boone Merrifield standing on her porch. She saw clearly for the first time the hairline fracture between who he presented himself to be and who he was when the presentation stopped working. The ease was gone. The modesty was gone. What remained was a man who had expected to get what he wanted because he had always gotten what he wanted, and who was discovering, with visible discomfort, that wanting was not the same as having. "I appreciate you coming by, Boone," she said, "and I appreciate your honesty, but I am not looking for a partnership. I am looking for something else entirely." Boone left. He walked to his horse and mounted and rode away, and Tessa watched him go and saw in the set of his shoulders the particular tension of a man who has been refused cleanly and does not know how to hold it. Across the field, the Hadley ranch was dark except for a single light in the kitchen window, the light that meant Cedric was awake, the light that meant he was sitting at his table and thinking about things in the thorough and careful way that he thought about everything. Tessa stood on her porch and looked at that light and allowed herself just for a moment to want it. Not the ranch, not the protection, not the practical advantage of an alliance with a man who owned 300 acres. The light, the man behind it, the quiet and the coffee and the conversation that never ran out and the rare smile that changed his whole face. She went inside and closed the door and did not know that at that exact moment, across the field, Cedric Hadley was standing in front of the small mirror by his kitchen door, looking at the gray hair and the lines and the 55 years of Colorado on his face, and having the specific conversation with his own reflection that a man has when he is trying to talk himself out of something that his better judgment has already decided. His better judgment won. He put on his hat, he stepped off the porch, and he walked across the field toward the south property, toward the fence line, toward the woman who had been crossing this same field every Tuesday for 3 years, carrying pies and conversation and a patience so steady it had become invisible. He did not know what he was going to say. He was not a man who planned speeches. He was a man who fixed fences and kept his word and said things plainly when he said them at all. And what he was about to say was the plainest and most terrifying thing he had ever attempted to put into words. The Colorado night held its breath. The mountains watched. And Cedric Hadley, 55 years old, a widower, a rancher, a man who had spent 3 years learning to live inside an empty house, walked across a moonlit field towards something he could not name and could no longer deny. Tessa was mending the south fence when she saw him coming, not on her property. At the fence line between them, the boundary that ran along the creek bed and divided his 300 acres from her 40, the line that was technically neutral territory, and that both of them had respected for 3 years with the particular care of people who understand that boundaries exist for reasons and that crossing them means something. Cedric stopped at the fence. He put his hands on the top rail. He looked at her with the expression she had seen only a few times in 3 years, the expression he wore when he had decided something and was committing to it fully, without reservation, without a back door, without the option of pretending later that he had not meant it. She kept working. She had learned over 3 years that Cedric Hadley said things in his own time and that waiting was more efficient than prompting. She pulled the wire tight. She set the staple. She drove it in with 2 clean strikes, and she waited. "Tessa," he said. "Cedric," she said without looking up. "I have been thinking about what you said." "Which thing?" I said. "You know which thing." She set down the fencing tool. She straightened. She looked at him across the top rail of the fence that divided their properties and their lives, and everything that had been carefully maintained between them for 3 years. 10 years would not be enough, he said. "I have been thinking about what that meant, and what you meant that night when you said you did not come because of the land. And what did you conclude?" He was quiet for a moment. The Colorado afternoon held them in the particular light of late October, the light that comes through the aspens when they have gone from gold to bare, and the sun has nothing left to filter through. The mountains stood where they always stood, but the snow was lower on the peaks now, and the air carried the clean, sharp promise of a season that does not negotiate. "I concluded," he said carefully, "that I do not know what you meant, and that I would like to." He looked at the fence rail. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a man who had built and repaired and held things together for 55 years. "I am 55 years old," he said. "I am aware of what that means and what it does not mean. I am not going to pretend it is nothing." He looked up at her. "But I would like to know if you are willing to tell me." She looked at this man, this careful, quiet, thoroughly decent man who had spent 3 years accepting her Tuesdays without ever asking why she kept coming, who had walked across a field at night because his better judgment had finally stopped arguing with his heart, who was standing at a fence line with his hands on the rail and his whole life in his voice, and asking her, in the most honest and most terrified way a man can ask, to tell him what he already knew but needed to hear. "It meant," she said, "that 10 years would not make you any more what I was looking for, because you are already exactly what I was looking for." The fence line between them was very quiet. A hawk crossed the Colorado sky above them, its shadow moving over the golden grass and then gone. The creek made the sound creeks make in late October, slower, thinner, the sound of water preparing for winter. Cedric Hadley looked at Tessa Langford and felt something arrive in his chest that he had not expected to feel again. Not an echo, not a memory wearing new clothes, something entirely its own, arriving on its own terms, asking nothing except to be acknowledged. He nodded, once. The way a man nods when he has received an answer that changes the shape of everything that comes after. The Harvest Social was on the last Saturday of October, held in the Grange Hall on the east end of Durango, where the old mining road met the new railroad tracks. Lanterns hung from the rafters. A fiddle player from Silverton had been hired, and he played with the loose, confident energy of a man who knew he was good and was having a fine time proving it. The hall smelled of pine and cider, and the particular warmth generated by 100 people in heavy coats who had come in from the cold and did not intend to go back into it any sooner than necessary. Tessa went. Cedric did not. He had not been to a social since Shea, and he was not ready for that particular exposure. The questions and the looks and the well-meaning comments that people offer when they notice something has changed and want to understand it before the people involved have finished understanding it themselves. Tessa understood this without it needing to be explained, the way she understood most things about Cedric, completely and without requiring him to perform the explanation. Boone Merrifield was there. He was charming. He danced well. He brought Tessa a cup of warm cider and stood beside her with the comfortable ease of a man who had decided to be gracious about the situation, regardless of how the situation had actually resolved, which was, Tessa acknowledged, a genuine quality and perhaps the best thing about him. Tamsin Whitford found her near the cider table. Tamsin was a good woman who had the particular directness of someone who considers diplomacy an inefficiency, and she deployed that directness now with the precision of a woman who has been waiting to say something and has run out of patience for waiting. "I hear you have been spending time at the Hadley Ranch," Tamsin said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "Cedric is my neighbor," Tessa said. "He has been for my entire life. He is also 55 years old." "I am aware." Tamsin set down her cup. "You are 25 years old and you have your whole life ahead of you. I say this as someone who wishes you well." Tessa looked at Boone across the room. He caught her looking and she smiled back, because courtesy cost nothing and because she bore him no ill will. Then she turned to Tamsin. "Do you know what Cedric Hadley did when my fence came down in the spring flood?" she said. "He was there the next morning, with lumber he could not really spare. He did not mention it afterward. Not once." She paused. She looked at Tamsin with the directness that Tamsin herself would have respected if she had been on the receiving end of it from anyone else. "That is not a small thing, Tamsin. That is the whole thing." She left the social early. She said her goodnights and thanked the people who needed thanking and walked out into the October night and stood for a moment in the cold air outside the Grange Hall, letting the sound of the fiddle and the laughter recede behind her as the door swung shut. The night was enormous. The kind of night that only happens in Colorado in late October, when the atmosphere is so clear that the stars seem closer than the nearest town, and the mountains are nothing but black shapes cut out of the sky with a blade. She untied her horse and mounted and rode home through that darkness, through air that tasted like the first real cold of the season, like wood smoke and frost and the mineral edge of snow that had not yet arrived but was gathering in the peaks above. The road was a pale line between dark fields. Her horse knew the way, and she let him find it while she looked at the mountains and thought. She thought about the whole thing. What it meant to know what it was when you saw it. What it cost to choose it when every reasonable argument pointed somewhere else. She thought about Tamsin Whitford's directness and Zella Vickers's advice, and the well-meaning calculations of people who measured compatibility in years and dollars and proximity, rather than in the quality of a man's silence on a porch or the reliability of his presence at a fence line the morning after a flood. She thought about the light in the kitchen window across the field, the light that would be on when she got home. The light that meant Cedric was awake, sitting at his table, thinking his careful thoughts, being exactly and thoroughly himself. Boone Merrifield was everything the town wanted for her. Cedric Hadley was what she wanted for herself. She had learned from her mother, who chose carefully, and her sister, who chose quickly, that those two things were rarely the same. And she had learned, in the 3 years she had spent crossing a field every Tuesday with a pie in her hands, that the things worth choosing were usually the things that could not be explained to people who had not stood where you were standing. November came, and with it, the particular clarity of Colorado in late autumn. The aspens had gone gold and then gone bare. The first real snow had settled on the peaks, not the tentative dustings of October, but the committed white that meant winter had arrived and intended to stay. The air had the clean, cold quality of a season that announces itself without apology. Cedric had been building something, not dramatically, not in any way he announced or drew attention to. Tessa noticed it the way she noticed everything about the Hadley ranch, incrementally, over visits that were no longer confined to Tuesdays but had expanded into Thursdays, and sometimes Saturdays, and once, on a Sunday afternoon, a long ride through the mountain meadows along the creek that connected their properties like a sentence connects two thoughts. The porch railing he had been meaning to fix for 2 years was fixed. The east-facing window in the kitchen had a new frame. The spare room, the one that had been closed for 3 years, was open, aired out, the accumulated weight of it gently cleared. She noticed all of this and said nothing, because saying something would have turned it into a performance, and what Cedric was doing was not a performance. It was preparation, the kind a man does when he has decided something and wants the evidence of his decision to speak for itself. On a Thursday in mid-November, not a Tuesday, which she noticed, he knocked on her door. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hand. The November light was behind him, thin and silver, the light that comes through bare branches and makes everything look honest. "I have been doing some work on the house," he said. "I know," she said. "You noticed, Cedric? I have been visiting that house for 3 years. I notice everything." He looked at his hat. He turned it in his hands once, slowly, the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts into the particular order that satisfied his need for precision. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly." She waited. She leaned against the doorframe, and she waited, and she gave him the time, because she had always given him the time, because time given freely was the currency of their entire history, and she was not about to change the denomination now. "Boone Merrifield is a good man," he said. "I know that. The town knows that. He is 28 years old, and he has good prospects, and there is every reasonable argument in his favor." He looked up at her. "I am 55 years old. I have a ranch that needs work and a porch that I just fixed and a kitchen window I replaced last week. I cannot compete with reasonable arguments." "Then do not," she said. He looked at her. The November air was between them. A magpie landed on the fence post nearest the door and observed them with the frank curiosity of a creature that has no stake in human complications but finds them interesting nonetheless. "I would like to come calling on you," he said. "Properly, if you will allow it." She looked at this man on her doorstep, with his hat in his hands, with his 55 years, with his fixed porch railing and his new window frame and his open spare room, each one a sentence in a declaration he had been writing for weeks with lumber and nails instead of words. "Cedric Hadley," she said, "I have been waiting for you to get here for approximately 3 years." He absorbed this. The information landed in him visibly, the way a stone lands in still water, and the ripples of it moved across his face. "I was thinking it through," he said. "I know," she said. "Come in. There is coffee." The courtship was conducted with the unhurried quality of two people who have known each other for years and are simply acknowledging what was already true. There were no grand gestures. There were suppers on the Hadley porch, where Cedric discovered that Tessa could talk about cattle futures and mountain weather and the novels she read by lamplight with the same fluency, shifting between subjects the way a good rider shifts between gaits, smoothly and without thinking about the mechanics. There were mornings when she arrived not with a pie, but with a question about the north pasture drainage, and they walked the property together, and she pointed out things he had not noticed in 30 years of looking, and he pointed out things she had not known to look for, and the combination of their attention made the land feel more fully seen than it had ever been. There were Sunday afternoons on horseback through the Colorado landscape, along the creek, and through the bare aspen groves, and up to the ridgeline where you could see the whole valley laid out below, the two properties side by side, the town of Durango in the distance, the railroad tracks catching the last light. On one of those rides, they stopped at the ridge and looked down, and Tessa said quietly that she had been looking at this view her whole life but had never seen it from this angle before. Cedric understood that she was not talking about the view. There was an evening in December when the first real blizzard came down from the peaks, and Tessa rode over through the driving snow because she had seen that his barn door was open from her kitchen window, and she knew he was out checking the cattle, and she wanted to make sure the horses were sheltered. She arrived to find that he had already closed the barn and was standing in the doorway waiting, not for her specifically, but for whatever came next, and what came next was her, snow in her hair and ice on her coat, and the particular expression of a woman who has ridden through a blizzard for the sake of horses that are not hers and does not consider this remarkable. He made her coffee. They sat at the kitchen table while the storm moved through the valley outside, and for the first time they sat in silence that was not the silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of two people who do not need to say anything, which is an entirely different kind of silence, and a considerably rarer one. When the storm passed, he walked her to her horse. The sky had cleared the way Colorado skies clear after storms, completely and without transition, from white to black to stars so dense they looked like someone had poured a bucket of light across the darkness. He helped her mount, which he had never done before, and his hand on her arm was steady and deliberate and said everything that his mouth had not yet managed to say in the months since he had knocked on her door with his hat in his hands. She rode home through the fresh snow under those stars and knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen correctly. Not because the evening had been dramatic, because it had been ordinary, and the ordinary moments were where the truth of a thing lived. Reverend Crandall raised the subject directly, because Reverend Crandall was a man who believed that pastoral duty sometimes required uncomfortable conversations and that avoiding them was a dereliction of his calling. "She is 25, the Reverend said. They were standing outside the church on a Sunday morning with their breath visible in the cold air. "You are 55. In 20 years. In 20 years, Cedric said, I will be 75. And in 20 years, she will have had 20 years of someone who sees her clearly and means what he says." He paused. The Sunday morning held them in the particular silence that follows church, the silence of people who have just been asked to consider things larger than themselves. "I think that is worth something, Reverend." The Reverend thought about this. He nodded once, and 4 months later, he performed the ceremony without further comment. They were married on a Saturday in February of 1884 in the Durango church on a morning when the sky was the pale silver of midwinter and the mountains were so white they disappeared into the clouds at their peaks. The church was small, pine pews, a single stove in the corner that someone had stoked to glowing an hour before the ceremony, and windows that let in the February light in thin, clean columns. The attendance was the particular attendance of a community that had opinions about something and wanted to see how it resolved. Every pew was full. The ranchers from the valley sat in their good coats. The women from town wore their winter dresses. The fiddle player from the harvest social sat in the back with his instrument case between his knees, though no one had asked him to play, because he had come not as a musician, but as a man who wanted to see a thing he had heard about and decide for himself whether it was what people said it was. Tessa wore a deep green dress the color of the Colorado pines because she was not a woman who felt required to follow conventions that did not suit her. She had sewn it herself, working by lamplight through the first 2 weeks of February with the same precision she brought to fence posts and account books and pie crusts. The fabric had come from Denver, ordered through the catalog, and it arrived on the Tuesday train, and she had it cut and pinned by Wednesday evening, because when Tessa Langford decided something was going to happen, the timeline of its happening shortened considerably. Cedric wore his good jacket, the one he had bought 10 years ago for occasions that required a good jacket, of which there had been very few, and which still fit because he was the kind of man whose body did not change much from decade to decade, held in its shape by work and by the particular metabolism of a man who eats what the land provides and does not eat more than he needs. He stood at the altar and looked at her coming toward him through the narrow aisle of the small church, and something happened in his chest that he had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. It was not nervousness. It was not doubt. It was the full and irreducible weight of 55 years of living, arriving at a single point, the way a river arrives at the sea, carrying everything it has gathered along the way. Every fence he had mended, every morning he had gone back to work because he did not know what else to do. Every Tuesday he had accepted a pie without asking why it kept arriving. Every night he had sat in the house that was too large for one person and looked at the empty chair. All of it had been carrying him here, to this small church, to this February morning, to this woman in a green dress walking toward him with the stride he had watched 100 times from across a field. He understood, standing there, that some things arrive when you have stopped looking for them, and that they are not less real for having arrived late. They are, if anything, more real because you recognize them for what they are instead of mistaking them for what you expected. Reverend Crandall performed the ceremony with the brevity and sincerity of a man who has said what he needed to say in private and trusts the public portion to take care of itself. The vows were simple. The ring was plain. The kiss was brief and honest, the kiss of two people who are not performing for the room but acknowledging something to each other. And the room understood this and respected it with a silence that was, for Durango, remarkable. Sterling Ingham sat in the back row and watched with the expression of a man whose assignment has been completed satisfactorily and who can now rest. His hands were folded on his knees. His eyes were bright. He did not applaud when the ceremony ended, but he nodded once, slowly the way a man nods when he has carried something a long distance and has finally set it down in the place where it belongs. Durango had opinions about the development. Of course it did. Tamsin Whitford thought it was unexpected and said so to anyone who would listen, which was everyone, because Tamsin's opinions were delivered with the volume and conviction of a woman who considers uncertainty a character flaw. Zella Vickers thought it was the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed, and said so louder and more frequently and to a wider audience, including several people who had not asked. Boone Merrifield was gracious about it in public, which elevated Tessa's opinion of him and moved his attentions to a banker's daughter from Denver within the month, which elevated it further. The banker's daughter was, by all accounts, charmed by his attention and grateful for his prospects, and the town approved of the match with the same enthusiasm it had previously directed at the match it had wanted for Tessa, because towns approve of matches the way they approve of weather, based on what is happening at the moment rather than what happened before. Tessa moved into the Hadley Ranch in March of 1884, on a day when the last snow was melting off the lower peaks and the first green was showing in the meadows along the creek. She brought her books and her mother's pie recipe and the particular competence that transformed the ranch accounts within the first month. Numbers that had been approximate became precise. Expenses that had been habitual became intentional. The ranch had been surviving under Cedric's stewardship. Under their shared management, it began to thrive. The work divided itself not by convention but by competence, which meant that Cedric cooked on the nights when Tessa was working the accounts late, and Tessa repaired fence posts on the mornings when Cedric was negotiating cattle prices in town. And neither of them found this remarkable, because neither of them had ever been interested in doing things the way other people expected them to be done. But Calder Merrifield had not stopped. The news of the marriage had accelerated his calculations rather than ending them. With Tessa's 40 acres now effectively merged into the Hadley operation, the simple foreclosure play no longer worked. The properties were joined by marriage and by shared management, and taking one without the other had become legally complicated in ways that Calder found personally offensive. In April, Calder filed papers to accelerate the foreclosure on Tessa's original 40 acres, citing a technical violation in the payment schedule that Tessa's parents had agreed to years before. The violation was thin, the argument was aggressive, but Calder Merrifield was not a man who relied on the strength of his arguments. He relied on the resources to litigate until the other side ran out of money or will. At the same time, Calder attempted to purchase the mineral rights on the Hadley Ranch property. He sent agents to the county recorder's office, he filed inquiries, he offered substantial sums, and he discovered, to his considerable irritation, that the mineral rights had already been registered by someone named Shea Hadley 3 years prior, and that the registration was locked in the personal safe of Judge Doane Prescott, and that Judge Prescott was not inclined to discuss the matter with anyone who was not named in the relevant document. Calder Merrifield was not accustomed to finding doors locked ahead of him. He was accustomed to being the man who locked the doors. In May of 1884, Judge Doane Prescott sent a letter by courier to 3 addresses, one to Cedric and Tessa Hadley at the ranch, one to Calder Merrifield at his offices in Durango, and one to the federal district attorney in Denver, which none of the other parties knew about at the time. The letter requested the presence of all named parties at the county courthouse on the first Tuesday of June, for a matter pertaining to the estate of Shea Hadley and to related filings by Calder Merrifield. Cedric read the letter on the porch. Tessa read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Tessa said, "She is still protecting us." Cedric folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and looked at the cottonwood where Shea was buried and said nothing, because some things do not require words, and because the words he might have said belonged to a conversation between himself and a woman who was no longer there to hear them, but who had, apparently, heard everything she needed to hear a long time ago. The courtroom was small, pine benches, a single window that let in the Colorado morning light and laid it across the floor in a bright rectangle that moved as the proceedings continued. Judge Doane Prescott was 71 years old and had been the county judge for 23 of those years and had the particular authority of a man who has spent decades listening to people argue and has developed through long practice the ability to determine exactly when the arguing is finished and the truth is ready to be stated. Cedric and Tessa sat on the left side. Cedric wore his good jacket, the same one he had worn to the wedding. Tessa wore the green dress. Sterling Ingham sat behind them, upright and still, his hat on his knee. Calder Merrifield sat on the right side with his attorney, a thin man from Denver who carried a leather case full of documents and the particular expression of a lawyer who has been paid well and intends to earn it. Boone Merrifield sat behind his father. His face was carefully neutral, the face of a man who has learned to watch without revealing what he thinks about what he is watching. Judge Prescott opened his safe. He removed 2 sets of documents. He placed them on his desk and looked at the room with the patient gravity of a man who has spent a career dealing with the consequences of other people's decisions and who has one more decision to deliver. The first document, Judge Prescott said, is the last will and testament of Shea Hadley, filed with this office 6 months before her death and witnessed by myself and by the county clerk. This will was filed separately from and in addition to the will that was executed at the time of Mrs. Hadley's passing and which distributed her personal property to her husband. The room was silent. Calder Merrifield's attorney opened his leather case. Calder himself sat very still. Judge Prescott read the relevant portions. Shea Hadley had, in this second will, formally registered the mineral rights to the entire Hadley Ranch property under her own name and bequeathed those rights to her husband, Cedric Hadley, with a single condition. The condition was that Cedric not spend the remainder of his life alone, that he allow himself to find happiness again, that he live, in her words, rather than merely continue. Judge Prescott looked at Cedric. "Mr. Hadley, you remarried in February of this year. The condition specified in your wife's will has been met. The mineral rights to the Hadley Ranch property are hereby formally transferred to you and to your current wife, Tessa Hadley, jointly and irrevocably." Cedric did not move. Tessa put her hand on his arm. Sterling Ingham, in the bench behind them, closed his eyes and exhaled the breath of a man who has been holding something for 3 years and can finally set down. Calder Merrifield stood. His attorney reached for his sleeve, but Calder was already speaking, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who has been outmaneuvered and does not accept it. He objected. He cited his own filings. He cited his purchase of the mortgage. He cited precedent and procedure and the particular indignation of a powerful man who has discovered that power has limits. Judge Prescott let him finish. Then he opened the second set of documents. "Mr. Merrifield," he said, "in the course of reviewing your foreclosure filing against the property of Tessa Langford Hadley, this court requested the original mortgage transfer documents from the Durango Bank. Upon examination, it was discovered that the signatures on 3 of the 4 transfer documents do not match the signatures on file with the bank. The notarization dates on 2 documents precede the actual dates of the transactions they purport to record." The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses down on everyone in the space and makes breathing feel deliberate. Judge Prescott continued. "This court has forwarded these documents to the federal district attorney in Denver for investigation of potential forgery of commercial instruments, which is a federal offense. The foreclosure filing on the Sheridan property is hereby dismissed. All mortgage obligations arising from the disputed transfer documents are voided pending the federal review." Calder Merrifield sat down. His attorney whispered something to him. Calder did not respond. He stared at the desk in front of him with the expression of a man who has built a machine and watched it turn on him. Boone Merrifield stood. He looked at his father. He looked across the aisle at Tessa, and for a moment his face held something that was not anger and not resentment, but something closer to recognition. The recognition of a man who has watched something play out and has finally understood which side of it he was on. He walked out of the courtroom without a word. His boots on the pine floor were the only sound. Calder left with his attorney through the side door. The door closed behind them with the finality of a chapter ending. The courtroom was silent for a long time after the side door closed. The rectangle of sunlight on the floor had moved from one side of the room to the other during the proceedings, and it now fell across the empty bench where Calder Merrifield had been sitting, illuminating the space he had occupied, as if the light itself wanted to confirm that it was vacant. Tessa sat in the courtroom and looked at that rectangle of light and thought about a woman she had known her entire life. A woman who had organized mending circles and remembered the names of everyone's horses and brought soup when the neighbors were sick. A woman who had sat in a room that smelled of lavender in a house on a ranch at the base of the Rocky Mountains and had looked out the window and seen a young woman crossing the field every Tuesday with a pie in her hands and an expression on her face that the young woman herself did not yet fully understand. And Shea Hadley had understood it. She had understood it completely. She had understood it the way she understood the land and the cattle and the mountain weather and the man she had married, with clarity and precision and without panic. And she had not been angry. She had not been threatened. She had looked at the situation with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, and she had made a plan. Not a plan born of jealousy or control. A plan born of love so complete that it extended past her own life and into the lives of people she would never see again. She had filed papers, she had signed documents, she had walked into a judge's office on a Tuesday afternoon and locked away a set of rights that would protect her husband from predators he did not yet know existed. She had written a letter and hidden it beneath a floorboard and trusted that he would find it when he was ready, not before, because she knew him well enough to know that finding it before he was ready would have broken something that needed to remain whole. She had entrusted the rest to a man she had known for 20 years, a man whose loyalty she had tested across 2 decades of shared labor and quiet observation, and she had told that man to wait, to hold the envelope, to watch for the sign. And the sign, she had said, would be the opening of her room. Because the opening of her room would mean that Cedric Hadley had finally stopped holding his breath, that he had finally allowed the past to be the past, that he was ready at last to live. Shea Hadley had protected them both. From the other side of something that most people consider final, she had protected her husband from spending his life alone, and she had protected the woman she knew would eventually stand to beside him from losing the ground she stood on. She had done this without recognition, without gratitude, without the possibility of ever knowing whether her plan had worked. She had done it purely, entirely, and absolutely because it was the right thing to do, and because she was the kind of woman who did the right thing regardless of whether she would be there to see the results. Tessa held Cedric's hand in the courtroom. He held hers. They did not speak. They did not need to. The sunlight moved across the floor. The mountains outside the courthouse window stood where they always stood, and somewhere beneath a cottonwood tree on the east side of a ranch in the valley below, a woman who had been gone for 4 years rested in the particular peace of someone whose work is finished and whose work was good. On an evening in July, a month after the courtroom, Tessa found Cedric on the porch. He was sitting in the chair he always sat in, looking at the mountains with the particular expression she had learned was his version of contentment. It was the expression of a man who has stopped performing emotions and is simply having them, plainly, without annotation. She sat beside him, the chair next to his, the one that had been empty for 3 years. The one that no one had sat in since Shea was not empty anymore. It had not been empty for months. And Tessa sat in it with the naturalness of someone who belongs exactly where she is and knows it. "Are you happy?" she asked, not anxiously, not as a question that required reassurance, just honestly. The way you ask someone something when you want the true answer and trust them to give it. Cedric looked at the mountains for a moment. The April evening was gentle. The snow was retreating up the peaks. The creek was running full with snowmelt, the sound of it carrying across the valley, the sound of things thawing and moving again after a long stillness. "I stopped expecting to be," he said. "That is not the same as not being." He looked at her. "I am happy," he said, simply, plainly. The way he said everything that mattered. She took his hand. The Colorado evening held them both. The cottonwood where Shea was buried cast a long shadow across the east side of the house, and the shadow reached almost to the porch. almost to where they sat, as if Shea herself were sitting beside them, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the woman who had made this possible by seeing clearly when no one else was looking, and by loving with the kind of precision that outlasts the person who practices it. On a September morning in 1884, 1 year after the pie and the joke and the morning on the porch that started everything, Cedric was at the north fence when he saw Tessa coming across the field. Not with a pie this time, just walking. Through the golden grass, under that Colorado sky, the improbable blue that made everything below it look arranged. She walked with the stride he had watched 100 times and never tired of watching, the stride of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had known for a long time. She came to the fence. He opened the gate. She stepped through and stood beside him and looked at the mountains that had been looking at them both for as long as either of them could remember. They stood there together in the September morning. The cattle were in the lower field. Flint the horse was standing in his usual spot by the barn, watching them with philosophical interest. Sterling was somewhere on the property, doing the quiet and essential work that Sterling did, the work of a man who had completed his assignment and had decided to stay, not because he was needed, but because he wanted to. The ranch was theirs. The 40 acres were theirs, free and clear, the fraudulent mortgage voided, the land returned to the name it should have carried all along. The mineral rights were theirs, filed and sealed and incontestable, a shield built by a woman who had understood that love was not only a feeling but an action, and that the most important actions were sometimes the ones no one saw. Cedric looked at Tessa. He looked at the valley. He looked at the mountains, doing what they always did, being permanent, being themselves, being the one thing in the landscape that did not change and did not need to. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. Not as a joke this time, not as deflection, not as the careful, self-deprecating remark of a man who is trying to say something without taking responsibility for having said it. He said it as an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who understands, with the full weight of 55 years and one extraordinary year beyond that, what he almost missed, what he almost talked himself out of, what he almost let arithmetic take from him because he was counting the wrong things. Tessa looked at him with the expression that had started everything, the expression he had not known how to read on that Tuesday morning a year ago and that he could read now with perfect clarity, the way you can read a landscape you have studied long enough to understand. 10 years would not have been enough, she said. I needed exactly you. Exactly this. The September morning held them. The hawks turned overhead. The mountains watched. The cottonwood where Shea was buried stood in the morning light with its leaves just beginning to turn. The first gold appearing at the edges the way gold always appears, slowly and then completely. They stood there for a long time. The September morning was patient with them. It offered its light and its warmth and its sky without asking anything in return, and they received it the way you receive something you have earned, not by demanding it, but by showing up long enough for it to arrive. The ranch spread out around them, the fences mended, the barn solid, the house with its new window frame and its fixed porch railing and its open spare room. The 40 acres to the south were theirs, free and clear. The mineral rights were theirs, sealed and incontestable. The old foreman was somewhere on the property, doing the quiet work of a man who had chosen to stay. The horse named Flint was in his usual spot by the barn, observing everything with the calm interest of a creature who has seen enough of human behavior to be neither surprised nor disappointed by any of it. Cedric Hadley closed the gate behind him and walked across the field with his wife in the Colorado morning. The grass was gold. The sky was blue. The mountains were permanent. And he was grateful, past all calculation, past all the arithmetic of age and years and reasonable arguments, that he had made the pie worth saying something foolish about. Cedric Hadley almost talked himself out of the best thing that ever happened to him. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride. Out of arithmetic, he counted his years and found them too many. He measured the distance between 55 and 25 and concluded that the distance disqualified him. He was being responsible. He was being realistic. He was being, as Tessa would have said with that dry patience of hers, wrong. Age is a real thing. It has real consequences and real weight, and anyone who says otherwise is not paying attention. Cedric knew that. Tessa knew that. They never pretended otherwise. But Cedric had made the mistake of confusing the arithmetic of years with the arithmetic of value. He had counted the number and concluded he was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Tessa counted differently. She counted the man who showed up with lumber the morning after the flood and never mentioned it. The man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The man who smiled rarely and meant it every time. That is not a man who has too many years. That is a man who has spent 55 years becoming exactly who he is. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who can see that most clearly is the one who has been watching from across the field. Do not let the arithmetic stop you from asking the question. Do not let the number on the calendar convince you that what you have to offer is not enough. It might be exactly enough. It might be precisely what someone has been waiting for across a field on a Tuesday morning with a pie in her hands. I want to say something before I go today. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Truly, you gave me something precious, your time and your attention, and I do not take either lightly. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone they think might need a quiet hour, that is what keeps this going. Wherever you are today, whether it is morning or evening, whether the sun is up or the stars are out, I hope this story gave you something warm to carry. May God bless every single one of you who listened today, every one of you. Until next time, take care.